Unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
In a moment or a few minutes from now, I'll introduce an amendment, but I wanted to talk about a bill that myself and 26 other senators have introduced today, and it's called the Enumerated Powers Act. Our founding fathers understood that the only way to preserve freedom for future generations was to limit federal authority. They understood the tendency of government to seize increasing power, and thus they created in our Constitution protections for posterity. Earlier this year, newly elected and returning members of the Senate took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. In my case, that oath never mentioned the state of Oklahoma or any other state or individual senator that any individual senator might represent. Rather, the oath that each of us took was to uphold the Constitution for the betterment of the country as a whole. Yet every day, members of Congress ignore their oath and protective principles embodied in the Constitution, trampling both the freedom and the prosperity of the American people. This has never been as evident as in the congressional spending spree we've seen over the last 3.5 to 4 years. At the beginning of the 111th Congress, our national debt stood at $10.6 trillion. It today is over $14.4 trillion, nearly $4 trillion in the last 3+ years. How did we get there? How did we get to such deep debt? How do we shackle our children and grandchildren to an increasing deficit and inevitable decreased standard of living? It really doesn't lie with any president that has done that. Where it lies is with the Congress of the United States. Today, along with the Senator from Kentucky, Dr. Rand Paul, and 23 other co-sponsors, I'm introducing the Enumerated Powers Act. This legislation ensures members of Congress truly follow Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. That section plainly lists the enumerated powers of the Constitution and enumerated powers given to Congress, of which there are 18 very well defined. One of the major reasons why we are facing such tough economic times and such tough fiscal challenges is because Congress routinely, in the recent past, has ignored this aspect of the Constitution. And until we reconnect Congress with its limited and enumerated powers, we will never put our nation back on a sustainable basis. James Madison stated in Federalist 51 that if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this: you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. Clearly, we have a government administered by men over men, and the government has failed to control itself. The best way for the federal government to appropriately restrain itself is for Congress to abide by the enumerated powers of the Constitution. The Supreme Court noted at the beginning of the 21st century, every law enacted by Congress must be based on one or more of its powers enumerated in the Constitution. The powers of the legislature are defined and limited, and that those limits may not be mistaken or forgotten, the Constitution is thus written. In an 1831 letter, James Madison stated, with respect to the words general welfare, which is what is so often used to justify new government programs, I have always regarded them as qualified by the detail of enumerated powers connected with them. To take them in a literal and unlimited sense would be, by and of itself, a metamorphosis of the Constitution into a character which there is a host of proofs was not contemplated by its writers and creators. Moreover, the 10th Amendment states, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. In other words, everything outside of those 18 enumerated powers are reserved for the states and the people. They're not ours to deal with. Our founding fathers intended for the federal government to be one of limited powers that cannot encroach on the powers reserved to the states or to the people. What this bill does is highlight the importance of those principles embodied in our Constitution and gives members of Congress a new procedural tool to stop unconstitutional legislation. Former Representative from Arizona, John Shadegg, Congressman Shadegg, took the lead on this issue starting in 1994 and introduced it every year up until he left Congress this last year. I joined Representative Shadegg in offering this bill starting in the 110th Congress and again in the 111th. And today I'm delighted to be, along with these 24 co-sponsors and many other Republicans, joining me to reintroduce an updated version of this important legislation. The Enumerated Powers Act requires each act of Congress, bill, and resolution to contain a concise explanation of the specific authority in the Constitution under which the measure would be enacted. It also states members cannot merely mindlessly invoke subsections of Article 1, Section 8, such as the commerce, general welfare, or necessary and proper clauses to meet that test. The goal of the legislation is to ensure that Congress is accountable to the American people for its actions. The very least we can do is, if we're going to violate Article 1, Section 8, is to explain our constitutional basis to the American people for that. With a sufficient two-thirds vote of the Senate, a point of order raised against a bill for failure to cite specific constitutional authority for the legislation can still be overcome. However, the Enumerated Powers Act requires both houses of Congress to debate that point of order. The American people need to see the transparency when we violate the Constitution and what our basis is for doing that. As I mentioned earlier, as members of the Senate, we've each taken an oath to uphold the Constitution, not to put our individual states first. If each of us abides by that oath, we will improve our country as a whole. For Oklahoma, Kentucky, or Maine, or any other state to fare well in our country, they cannot do so if the country as a whole is not faring well. Let me take a moment and just use as an example one of the reasons that I would like the Enumerated Powers Act passed, but also why I'm going to discuss the amendment that I have at the desk. Here's what we know right now from the first third of the federal government that was studied by the Government Accounting Office. They just looked at the first third of the federal government, and we asked them in the last debt limit increase to give us the list of duplications of programs that do essentially the same thing across that first third. We'll get the next third about 6 months from now and the final third a year from then. But what you see and what they came up with is we have more than 100 different federal programs for surface transportation. That's 100 sets of agencies, that's 100 sets of bureaucracies, and that's mindless and thousands upon hundreds of thousands of rules and regulations that just on surface transportation. Nobody in Congress knew we had 100 agencies. Teacher quality. We have 82 separate teacher quality programs across 6 different government agencies. One is, it's a question of whether or not that's a responsibility of the federal government under the Enumerated Powers Act, but to have 82? Or how about economic development? 88. 80 of which are under 4 different agencies, which we just had a bill on the floor, the Economic Development Act. It was one of 80 programs run by those 4 agencies. None of them have metrics to see if they're effective. They have anecdotal evidence, but there's no metrics to see if they are. And again, 88 sets of bureaucracies within all these agencies. Duplication after duplication after duplication. Transportation assistance, 80 different programs. Financial literacy. A government that's $14 trillion in debt, running a $1.6 trillion deficit, has no business telling anybody about financial literacy. And yet we have 56 programs across multiple agencies teaching the American people about financial literacy. I think the source of that wisdom is somewhat questionable. We have 47 different job training programs, cost $18 billion a year, run across 9 different agencies. Not one of them has a metric. And all but 3 duplicate what the other 44 are doing. Why would we do that? Why would we have all that? Homeless prevention and assistance. We have 20 programs out of the federal government for homeless prevention and assistance. Food for the hungry. We have 18 separate programs. Disaster response and preparedness through FEMA. We have 17 different programs. So the point is we got there for two reasons. One is we didn't look at the enumerated powers. And number two is too often we're trying to fix a problem from great intent, the right heart, even when it is constitutional and would meet the demands of Article 1, Section 8. We have no idea what else is out there. So when we see a problem, rather than to go see what we're doing now, we create a new program. And so I would ask consideration of my amendment, which is amendment number 500, which is an amendment to change the rules of the Senate, the standing rules. And what it does is that it mandates a rule in the Senate that every report that comes to the Senate, every bill, an analysis by the Congressional Research Service to determine if the bill or joint resolution creates any new federal program, one, any new federal office, or any new initiative that would duplicate or overlap any other existing federal program, any other existing federal office, or any other existing initiative with similar mission, similar purpose, similar goals or activities, along with a listing of all the overlapping or duplication. And an explanation provided by the committee as to why the creation of another new program, office, or initiative is necessary if a similar program or programs office or initiative or initiatives already exist. So it's a rule change, and the reason that I bring it to this bill is because this is a bill for rule changes. And it requires 67 votes for this to pass. I understand that we've heard some concerns from the Congressional Research Service, but with the work that the Government Accounting Office has done and will do, it will be very easy for them to look at the results of the Government Accounting Office and their list of duplications, and it's very straightforward. It's less than 100 pages, and they can see, and then they can advise the Congress on what we have. If we cannot depend on the Congressional Research Service to tell us where we have multiple programs when that's available from the Government Accounting Office and list what their intentions and what their budgets are, then we need to relook at the Congressional Office and what it does. They do great work for me. We ask them for things all the time, and they do great. This is something that they can accomplish. It's going to get easier as we go forward. But without this knowledge of what we're already doing, we'll never solve our problems. So my hope is, and I know my chairman has some concerns with this initiative in terms of how it might affect this bill, but I plan on going right back to the Congressional Research Service to have a discussion with them after I'm on the floor, after I've been on the floor. But if we can't do this, we can't do anything. If we can't change the rules so we actually know what we're doing, so we can actually know if a new bill duplicates something that's already operating when we have this tremendous list, and this is just a small set of the list. I just picked some of the obvious ones. There's hundreds of thousands of duplicate programs in the federal government, wasting billions, if not trillions of dollars every year. So if we can't do something like this, then what can we do to solve our problems? Knowledge is power. And knowing what programs are intended to do now before we create another new program, to me, is the height of insanity. We should be aggressively asking for as much information as we can get so we know what we're doing when we pass new pieces of legislation. With that, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Maine.
Madam President, I'm not going to take long at this point. I absolutely support the policy behind the amendment offered by my friend and colleague, Senator Coburn. In fact, I'm a co-sponsor of a standalone bill that he has on this issue. My concern is that it is a rules change, and the bill before us is not a rules change. It's not a resolution, it's not a rules change, it's legislation. Now, coming up after this bill is the second half of the nominations reform package. And that is a rules change that is coming from the Rules Committee. So my suggestion to my colleague and friend from Oklahoma is that his amendment would be better directed to the second half than to this bill. But again, I'm a co-sponsor of his standalone bill, so it's not that I object to the policy. I would note, for the information of my colleagues, that the Congressional Research Service does have concerns about whether it has the resources and the ability to carry out the task that the senator would assign it. From my many years of working both with GAO and CRS, this sounds to me like a job for GAO, which has the auditors and the experience to do this kind of review, and indeed has already started due to the good senator's far-sighted amendment, which became law, to identify duplication. Thank you, Mr. President.
Yeah, I would ask to call up my amendment number 500, and then I would also tell the senator from Maine I will very much consider your recommendation in terms of trying to put it on the second half of this, but I'd like to call it up now and then ask that maybe that we withdraw it.
Clerk will report the amendment.
The senator from Oklahoma, Mr. Coburn, for himself and others, proposes an amendment numbered 500.
I ask that it be considered.